All right. Yep, so long as that's actually recording in the background, that's fine by me. Okay, well, economics. So I'm going to talk about economic self-image first of all, because if you take a look at the vision they've got of their own behaviour, mention I'm saying they, and I'm a professor of economics, to say how sorry I fit outside my own discipline. The self-image is the mathematical social science, and both those emphasised words are important. And I'm now quoting from somebody you won't know, but I'll show you his status later. And this is a paper written in 2000 saying it's not just a social science, it's a genuine science. And it said that it's just like the physical sciences, it uses a methodology producing refutable implications and tests them using statistical techniques. And it stresses three factors. I'm going to focus on two of the three he talks about. It says economists use the construct of rational individuals engaged in maximising behaviour. That's one of the assumptions you would have been challenging as you were sitting in as professor of anthropology in a first-year economics course. Economic models adhere strictly to the importance of equilibrium as a part of any theory. And finally, focus on efficiency, which I won't spend quite so much time on. And he said those ingredients, and now notice the word here, these ingredients have allowed economics to invade territory previously deemed to being outside its realm. Title of the article, I'm not joking, Economic Imperialism. Right? Person who published it, not a name most of you would know, but he was an economic advisor to George W. And he was therefore in the hot seat when the financial crisis began, because the handover from George W. to Obama, I think was in the American system, as the March or February of the following year. So it wasn't until 2009 that Obama's advisors took over. He wrote that paper in 2000, and it was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is published by the Harvard University Department of Economics, and ranks certainly in the top 5 amongst economic journals. So the referees and the editor had to agree with this very polemic article about the nature of economics. Well, that was then. What's happening now? You might know this guy's name. So this is somebody looking retrospectively, obviously. 7 years ago, all seemed well in macroeconomics. The Great Moderation was used to describe the period from 1980, or pretty much 1990 more strictly, but 1980 on, when every recession had a lower level of unemployment and every boom had a lower level of inflation than previous booms. And they saw this being a period what they called the Great Moderation, reducing volatility and unemployment and inflation, and both of them trending down as well. The technology they use these days, they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, DSGE. A very pompous word, set of phrase rather. I'll pull out 2 of the 4 words to describe it accurately. As far as I'm concerned, it's stochastic equilibrium economics. And they said the widespread support that, given this theoretical background, all it proposed was the economy can be controlled by the central bank manipulating the rate of interest. And then the crisis occurred, and there's now a crisis in macroeconomics. So do you know the name Larry Summers? Okay, some of you do. Okay, those that don't, he's famous for 2 things. First of all, being a very forthright, opinionated advisor particularly to Obama, but seen as the brightest guy in the room, somebody who tells everybody what should happen. He had argued against the regulation of derivatives before they happened, stopped that occurring. And he also managed to get himself evicted from Harvard University when he made a comment about women not having the same mathematical capabilities as men. I understand you've got some sympathies for that sort of behaviour here at Sussex. Okay. So back to Lazar and what he thought the discipline was about. The first thing, rational individuals who believe in maximising behaviour. Rational. Well, there's plenty of work now, it's called behavioural economics, which is like it started actually in psychology with Kahneman getting eventually the Nobel Prize in economics for work inspired by psychological tests to see whether people actually behave this way. But the main one I focus on is a direct test of what neoclassicals call their theory of rational behaviour, which is called the theory of revealed preference. And this was tested the test was published back in 1997. And this is the conclusion of the author. I think he was trying to validate the theory to a small group of students, and then we got quite a surprise when it actually contradicted the theory. It's a very honest and I think very, very deep article, well worth reading. So we find a considerable number of violations of the axioms contradicting the neoclassical theory of utility maximisation subject to a budget constraint. And we should therefore pay close attention to the limits of this theory and recognise them. And notice this comment, we should be a little modest in our imperialist ambitions of explaining non-market behaviour by economic principles. Now that was written 3 years before Lazare published his paper talking about economic imperialism. So it shows how little the discipline reads its own literature, let alone literature outside its own purview. And working from individuals to the macro, which is another part of that. Well, look at the physical sciences. You can see that was abandoned about at least 40 years ago. And this is now quoting a wonderful paper by a physics Nobel laureate, therefore a real Nobel Prize, Philip Anderson. Beautiful paper called More is Different. And he said, looking at reductionism, one of the fallacies it encourages is the belief that you can take a complex problem and reduce it to its components. But then that also, people think the constructivist way, you can start with the components and build up the macro level. And he said the ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the possibility to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. And if they did, a typical biology examination question would be, please take these chemicals and create life. Okay? And so therefore the behaviour of complex aggregates of elementary particles cannot be understood by simply extrapolating the properties of a few particles, which is precisely what economic theory tries to do with those so-called DSG models and virtually everything else. Instead, each new level of analysis has got its own criteria, its own legitimacy, and it involves originality just as original as the work at the lower levels. And that's from physics 50 years ago, virtually. Equilibrium. Again, this is I see this as the core problem in neoclassical theory, the belief that you have to model every dynamic process as if it is a transition from one equilibrium state to another. Now, what do the physical sciences do? Well, the work that dominates these days is far from equilibrium, non-linearity, complexity, and chaos. And the first example of that was Lorenz's butterfly model. You heard of the butterfly effect? Have you ever seen it? Okay, some of you have. This is Lorenz's model in equilibrium. I think that's ravishingly exciting, don't you? Okay. Here's it knocked out of equilibrium. And just to show what goes on, I'm going to load it in the software package I've had designed called Minsky, which is a way of building system dynamics models. And if I run it in equilibrium, that's the exciting image I showed you on the left-hand side. If I just give it with a tiny shock in the very first step, and then I go back to no shock at all and run it, this is what happens. The system actually has 3 equilibria, all are unstable. And what you get therefore is what's called a strange attractor. The paper was actually titled Deterministic Aperiodic Chaos. Deterministic Aperiodic Cycles. And that's what actually goes on here. And as you can see on the main XY plot going on there, what you start seeing ultimately looks like wings of a butterfly. The points that are being highlighted by not being invaded by the model at all are the equilibria. So the equilibria of this model tells you where it will never be, rather than saying everything has to be in equilibrium. That's what's common in science these days, and economics completely fails to adopt it. There are people working in nonlinear work, such as myself, but we're outside the mainstream. And efficiency, well, I don't know what's sufficient about the level of unemployment in Greece right now, or the rest of Europe for that matter, and the unemployment of the financial crisis. We've reached a level of unemployment in Greece which is 27% of the workforce. That's hardly an efficient use of resources. So partly that's just an aside on the efficiency, but I see economics as having a pretense to being a mathematical discipline, because there have been many fundamental critiques of theory inside economics as well. There's one by a guy called Piero Sraffa at Cambridge, where he showed that if you try to measure capital accurately, which involves adding up by looking at the labour that goes into make the machinery over time, once you do that, you get a very nonlinear relationship between the amount of profit, capital you measure that you have, and the rate of profit that applies. And the result of that is that the conventional theory argues that the rate of profit reflects the productivity of capital. And the more capital you have, the lower the rate of profit. But what Sraffa showed was the amount of capital that measure you actually have depends upon the rate of profit in a highly non-linear way. There's no way you can say that it's therefore that the rate of return of capital is a return for its contribution to output. It's got to be something else. Another one which occurred in the 1960s, but emanates from mathematics back in the 1930s, is that what's called general equilibrium, and the old-fashioned version of general equilibrium, which is now about 30 years out of date, only because they've moved on by ignoring problems with that area, is where you try to model the economy consisting of a large number of sectors, each of which rely on reducing its output by buying inputs. Buying outputs of the other sectors as inputs for this sector. So you get a matrix of numbers, and that gives you 2 conditions for stability. Prices have to converge to an equilibrium set of relative prices, otherwise you've got disequilibrium. and quantities have to grow smoothly across all sectors, otherwise you've got instability in output. Those two conditions are inconsistent mathematically. One or the other must not happen. If you get stability in one, you don't get the stability in the other. It's a mathematical property of what I call square non-negative matrices. The third one, which I think is actually more crucial again, most of you would have seen a textbook model with a downward sloping demand curve for an individual, derived from the concepts of theory, and then a downward sloping market demand curve. This theorem, done by 3 of the leading mathematical economists, proved that that wasn't possible. If you had a whole bunch of individuals with downward sloping individual demand curves, add them up, you can get any shape you can draw with a polynomial. Okay? It doesn't have to be downward sloping at all. They don't. So those are the 3, in my opinion, devastating results for the theorem. So what should have been the reaction to a truly mathematical discipline? You would have had to abandon the theory of income distribution and say profit as a surplus as it was in classical economics, abandon the quest to make everything work out from would be based on equilibrium, because you're out of equilibrium, even in general equilibrium, so-called, you don't get stability there. And you can't work up from the individual, because even aggregating well-behaved individual demand curves, which themselves can't exist, empirically not going to happen, you find you don't get well-behaved market demand curves anyway. So if it was truly mathematical, it would have completely transformed itself with those results. Instead, they ignore it. The theory still uses marginal productivity theory. Equilibrium is still assumed, but in a different form. And they've got this travesty of talking about the entire economy as a representative agent. Now, they bring what they call heterogeneous agents, but they still lump workers and capitalists together into one agent. Well, that's nice. I'd like some of Richard Branson's income too, but I'm not going to get it. So I see it as a fundamentally anti-mathematical school. What's actually going on is a teleology. They have a set of beliefs they wish to reach, and they're going to get there no matter what, even if they prove themselves wrong on the way. So what's actually going on makes much more sense when you see it from a point of view of the methodology of science, so long as you accept also that economics isn't one. So they've got Kuhn on paradigms and talking about the way paradigms develop, and then people defend the paradigm until it has a breakdown. Lakatsov's talking about a hard core of assumptions which you don't touch, and then a protected belt you adjust around it. That's accurately characterising how economics is behaving right now. So the change is going to happen. It won't come from inside the discipline. It's got to come from new students, or it's got to come from people outside. And again, this is not something I blame on economists solely, because it's the behaviour you can see in other sciences. The difference is that there are experimental tests to get us out of the traps we have with previous disciplines. Max Planck spoke about the same thing for physics, writing back in the 19th century and the early 20th, saying his frustration in trying to convince people of quantum mechanics when he first proved that energy was discrete. He said a new scientific truth triumphs not by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because the opponents die. And a new generation grows up to them familiar with the idea. Now, that's more difficult in economics because it's so isolated. This stuff has happened in other disciplines, and it simply hasn't broken through the brick wall of economic methodology, and it can't be irrefutable experiments. It's easy to find reasons why Greece has failed because they drink too many, God knows what, but you can blame it on Retsina and get away with it and not worry about the case of 27% unemployment. So the teleological nature of the theory gets in the way. And I don't just blame the conservative ideology here, which is what neoclassical economics is. A similar thing can be said about Marxian approach, where people hang on to the label theory of value, despite the fact that it's got logical flaws. So it's a problem with the entire discipline, and it desperately needs injections from outside. Thank you.